Welcome back from lunch. I hope you had tasty treats because we certainly did here. We are so appreciative for AT&T hosting and sponsoring us and making sure that we had all the vittles that we needed to enjoy yet another wonderful panel coming up. So, Miss Ebony, I'm going to drop the mic right back in your lap for this next one.
Well, I love a mic drop from Miss Kimberly, so thank you. I'll receive. Welcome back. What we know is that a lot of corporations have finally come to the realization that their company needs to be a partner in what we call social change. They know that it has a direct impact on the society and also their cultural and corporate footprint. We know that now, thank goodness, society requires that there are a number of causes and mandates in which companies have to show up for. They must demonstrate empathy. As a result, many of the corporations we have today have decided to pool their resources, all in an effort to be efficient. And when it comes to DEI and ESG, we know that both of those are important in their work, and their subject matter can sometimes overlap. But then there's other times in which people have to do the necessary work to give it specialized and individual attention. So the challenge comes when these same corporations take this all-encompassing approach. They try to be everything to everybody, and they don't acknowledge the individuality in which some of these causes require. And when they do that, it can lose its impact. In this particular conversation, we want to ask questions. We want to talk about how corporations can spread their resources all across the spectrum and have important and competent impact with each one. Additionally, we want to talk about how decision-making regards the resources and can that division show up equally. We've got some incredible experts for this conversation. Mr. Kevin L. Clayton, he is Senior Vice President and Head of Social Impact and Equity with Rock Entertainment Group and the Cleveland Cavaliers. Also with us is Dr. Christopher J. Metzler. He's Senior Vice President of Corporate DEI and ESG for the National Urban League. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this conversation.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Evan.
Let's start with not taking for granted that everybody knows what ESG is. Dr. Chris, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Distinguish DEI and ESG for us.
So from an ESG standpoint, E being the environmental piece, you're looking at impact on the environment, et cetera. S being the social piece. So what are you doing from a social justice standpoint? G being the governance piece. So that's ESG. When you go into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So diversity, who's in the workplace, who shows up. When you look at equity, it is equity of process, not necessarily equity of outcome. And then inclusion meaning in making sure that everyone feels that they are a part of the workplace. Difficulty with inclusion is organizations are not paying enough attention to psychological safety and neurodiversity.
Okay, Dr. Chris, you can't give us those big words and not help us unpack, because I know I'm not the only one. I know neuro is brain. However, talk a little bit more about what you're getting to at the heart of the neurological part.
Well, from the neurological standpoint, we have to look at different thinking styles. We also have to look at the issue of mental health and mental wellness in the workplace. From a psychological safety standpoint, when I show up to work, do I feel that, in fact, I belong there? How is my supervisor interacting with me? Do I feel I'll be fired at any point? So those are the things that we're talking about.
Okay. Do we feel safe at work?
Yes,
Indeed.
pretty much.
Kevin, talk about how the ESG part can correlate with DE&I, but also how at times it needs to be separate work.
Yeah, so Ebony, it's interesting, and Dr. Messler and I have had this conversation. As we talk about ESG, ESG is being used actually to camouflage DE&I.
Correct.
It's being used to hide DE&I. And I'll give you a very, very specific example. In Cleveland, I was with a group of leaders, and these leaders were talking about how they're going to attract businesses to Cleveland, and that was what this organization was for. They talked about DE&I and how important it was, similar to what Chris has just said. And then when it came to publicly introducing this, they introduced it under ESG. So either DEI is a thing and it's important, or it's not. So the correlation between the two is that when you talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, those are very specific tactics, strategies, and outcomes. ESG, which was kind of born out of shareholders actually connecting this to revenue, that's why it became to rise at the level that it is right now. DE&I for most organizations has not been part of the revenue conversation, so therefore if it's where we're going to focus, it's corporations are focusing on the ESG part because shareholders are holding them accountable. They're not holding them accountable for DE&I outcomes.
Dr. Metzler, I saw you nodding enthusiastically. Speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at DEI, where are most DEI officers? They're in HR.
HR. Yep.
The reason that they are in HR is because there is no accountability. And by the way, people need to stop telling me that most DEI officers are black. They're not. Because for the most part,
white women mostly?
White women, because they're in HR.
Right.
And so that's what you've got. Now, with ESG, everyone's focusing to the social aspect of this. Here's the problem with that. This is about governance. Governance is really where accountability comes in. What's happening here, as Kevin said, is they're trying to camouflage this and run to the social piece. Oh, look at all these social justice things we've done. You're doing the same thing that you did to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The environmental piece is what it is, but we have to be very careful to say that this is the future of DEI. It is not. It is essentially something that is going to get rid of DEI and relegate it back to compliance.
Yeah, it's actually the demise.
It is.
It is not the
Solution.
it's not the solution.
Correct.
Say more about that, please.
Yep. So going back to the conversation I was saying with these leaders, and I asked them directly, why don't you call it what it is? What it is diversity, inclusion, and equity, and how you leverage that to bring in companies to Cleveland. And they said, we don't think that we will get the response from our corporate partners if we call it DEI, but ESG, it's more comfortable, it's safer.
Oh,
so therefore, we'll call it ESG, but Kevin, trust me, the outcomes are going to be the same. I'm like, well, it's not going to be the same because it's not going to resonate with people the same way.
This is fascinating, right? So it's almost like a bait and switch is what I'm hearing described. And Dr. Metz, right? Like, I'm sorry.
That's what it is.
I've been watching Philadelphia on repeat this whole pandemic. So sometimes you have to break things down to be like, I'm a 6-year-old. I'm glad. Thank you for appreciating the joke. Dr. Metzler, please talk a little bit more about why that is the advantage. Why is that the play?
Well, it's the plan because, look, let's be real. Organizations talk about diversity is the right thing to do. Well, if it's the right thing to do, why hasn't it been done? Over all this period of time, and you're telling me it's the right thing to do? In addition to which, you look at the state of a number of diversity officers, they have no clue about the business they're in, which is why, to Kevin's point, it is not a business unit. They can call it what they want. You have a conversation with a number of diversity professionals. What business are you in? We sell and manufacture software. Okay. What's the business? What do your balance sheets look like? How, in fact, and this is why I completely cannot stand, and I've said it over and over again, the notion of a business case for diversity. There is no business case. There is, however, a value proposition. Here's the difference. What is the value of diversity to the business, to its employees? That's the conversation we need to have. But in order to have that value conversation, first of all, chief diversity officers, you need to be able to do something very simple like, oh, I don't know, read a balance sheet. And if you're unable to perform business functions, they will see you simply as doing training or managing the ERGs or something like that, having the Soul Food Fridays, the Taco Tuesdays, and that's
soft skills. So I have to recall an earlier panelist that talked about what matters is measured and what is measured matters. Kevin, can you kind of correlate that framework to what we're talking about in this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, what I've always done is connected the work of DE&I to the bottom line of any
Yes.
organization. So where I have a different point of view around the business case, only because if it's not quantified, then it's just kind of qualitative rhetoric. So in order to quantify this work and what the metrics are, it has to be tied to the common language that everybody in the organization understands.
Right.
They don't understand this is the right thing to do because I'm emotionally tied to it. They understand this is going to help us to sell more product. In my case, this is going to help us to bring in more fans. This is
Right.
going to have more viewership of our team. So with that, what we've been able to do is to tie this to a scorecard that is measured across multiple aspects of our business, just like every other department, and it's tied to compensation, and it's also tied to performance development. So when you start tying this work, which is what ESG does, when you tie the DE&I work into an organization's compensation structure, now it's not a nice thing to do or the right thing to do because I feel it from a societal standpoint. It's because it's job imperative number one.
Yeah, it's no longer just coming from this emotional kind of ancillary place. It's business.
Yeah, and we don't disagree. We fundamentally agree on that. I'm just saying that it's more about value rather than going back to when Roosevelt Thomas came out with a business case for diversity as a push away from a critique of diversity. And if you look at the work that Kevin does, Kevin's work measures impact. That's the most important thing. You talk to chief diversity officers and organizations about measuring impact. Well, I'm not sure what that means. And it is both quantitative and qualitative. You can't just talk to a couple of people and say, how's it going?
Right.
That's not enough. So his work really measures and can quantify for you what the impact is, and that's where this has to go. And as it relates to comp, we have to be very clear with people about comp. Is it variable comp? Is it total comp? What is this compensation? Because if it is comp that basically says you may get a bonus or you may not. No, let's be 100% transparent as to what compensation it's been tied to. So absolutely right.
So, okay, I'm going to get back to these questions on the card in a minute, but I have to follow my own curiosity for a moment here. Number one, I've long felt, because I've talked to enough colleagues of my own in my daily life that are, and most of them have served as DE&I officers, and they've frankly already been ceremoniously dismissed, right? We've all seen it. And I think what we know when we say the quiet part out loud, really going to what both of you have really centered for me here in this conversation, is that a lot of times these DE&I chiefs, especially the chief position, they're PR solves. They are. They are remedies. I mean, we saw it with Gucci. We see it. I mean, I won't even name the corporations because it's all of them, right? Where there's horrific display of anti-blackness or transphobia or anti-Semitism. What you pick an ailment. And then the solve becomes we're going to implement and install this chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer that will remedy our problem, and it never does. So my question becomes, and I'll come to you first on this, Kevin, is EGC?
ESG.
ESG. If we lean more into the ESG of it all, is that because it sounds like it's more measurable and they're better at tying it to the commercial interest and the fiscal bottom line, is that a better approach really to solving some of these issues?
Yeah, so Ebony, you came right down the middle of the plate for me on something that irritates the hell out of me. And here's what irritates it. So post or pre-George Floyd, now I'm gonna give you an example
Please.
to answer your question.
Okay.
And I want to talk about sports. There's 147 professional sports teams across the 5 major sports.
Okay.
NHL, hockey, soccer, baseball, basketball. And at that time, and I'm talking about 4 years ago, when I got my position, I was the 4th C-suite level individual with dedicated resources to do the work of DE&I out of 147 sports teams.
Oh, wow. So
The
you mean
fourth.
across the sports
I'm talking
spectrum.
every single
Wow,
league.
okay.
All 4 were in the NBA. So with that, post George Floyd in 2020, now there's probably about 80 such officers that do this work all aren't created equal. But here's the thing that I find fascinating, why it irritates the hell out of me. There is not a profession in any line of business, nonprofit or for-profit, that people get jobs based on their skin color or their gender. The jobs for DE&I officers, generally speaking, no, not all of them, came out of, oh, here's a crisis, let me go find the highest ranking person of color or female to now you're a chief diversity officer. So we have been set up this work has been set up to fail because the focus has been on, we need to get more black people in our organization. We need to focus on one particular group. People aren't having that.
Right.
Corporations aren't having that. So unless the DE&I landscape incorporates the benefit for all, yes, the black community, the house is on fire for us right now. So we're going to put out that fire, but if we would not take resources to the garage to put out what happens in the garage where there's no fire. So here's the point to connect the dots. So with the DE&I work, and you were talking about kind of an ESG perspective, what I have been able to do when my position kind of got elevated to include 4 or 5 other functions, I changed the title. I took the DE&I out. It falls underneath me with someone else. My title is Social Impact and Equity, which is outcomes of the work. So that is measurable.
The impact.
The impact. So with that, that's measurable. And the other part of that is that we have built in quantitative metrics that then connect the work of impact. So as Chris was talking about the impact, we can quantify almost every single thing that we do. And that is the language that the organization speaks.
That makes a lot of sense. Dr. Metzler, I just don't want to.
Yeah, no, it makes, that is exactly the point, is to get it to that impact lens. The difficulty is simply moving it to ESG doesn't do that.
Okay.
There is a larger conversation behind that. Look at job descriptions for chief diversity officers. It is all HR. It is all talent retention. What about supplier diversity?
Right, because I will just acknowledge my ignorance. I have a very dear friend who is an executive in supplier diversity. And y'all, for 3 years, this is my chapter soar, for 3 years, I thought this woman worked in HR.
Yeah.
I really did. It took so much education and unpacking of what she actually does for me to realize that is an entire separate entity from human resources.
Yeah, and so when you look at supplier diversity, the issue is you want these organizations, the suppliers, the diverse suppliers, to become larger. So guess what? They can buy from you.
Yeah.
That's the point. That's something that you can quantify. But again, before you move it to ESG, and before you kind of talk about a merger there, you have got to change the way diversity officers are recruited, developed, and positioned. Until you do that, it's going to fall flat on its face.
Yep.
Every time. Wow, this is already just so, it's really provocative. When I hear you two talk, we need to reframe.
Yes.
You know, a lot of this is the reframing of how we think and what we expect or what we require of, quote, DE&I. Let's go to examples of success. Kevin, can you speak to when it comes to your work and how ESG is a part of your work, how it has shown up in ways of measured success?
Sure. And I'll connect the dots on the societal piece.
Please.
So we also run our building, which is Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, seat 19,000 people. We do over 250 events in our building.
Great.
Our partner on the food service standpoint is Aramark. So if you think about food scarcity, and I'm going someplace with this, if you think about food scarcity and how the impact of food scarcity has in a community, it impacts gun violence, it impacts health outputs, it impacts education, everything else. So what we have recently done, and shame on us for not knowing ahead of time, but there were some reasons why, we are now working with Aramark from a waste standpoint. And I'd say, talking about waste, I'm talking about food that goes uneaten on any given night, any given event, and I'm talking about platters of salmon, platters of steak, all of this kind of stuff. Typically what we would do with that food is throw it away. So now what we have done, and there's some safety issues and precautions, so if you connect the dots between, from a DE&I external standpoint, I want to focus on those communities of need. We're partnering with Aramark to say, okay, how can we safely provide communities with this food every other night that we have that go to communities. So there's the societal piece
Yep.
on the ESG piece, and it also connects to communities in need from a DI standpoint.
And from a fiscal lens, it's not like more money.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which is,
Right.
I think, very important in this conversation.
Right.
Very, very fascinating. Dr. Metzler, do you want to share any examples of where you've seen the success?
Yeah, so the World Cup that was just held, I was a senior dean at Georgetown for the bidding of the World Cup. One of the things that was necessary was they needed 10 votes from African countries. So they came up to me and said, "You're the black guy, go talk to the
They
countries."
did not.
Yeah. I said, first of all, I was not born in an African country, number one. Number two, they're going to say, okay, and? So what we decided to
Wow.
do instead, Qatar built 15 stadia. Qatar is very small. It can't sustain those. So what we did was, for those countries, build portable stadia. So World Cup's over. Qatar is going to roll the stadia off, bring them to the 10 countries, and they're going to manage and upskill the locals as to how to run a soccer stadium. So that's one of the successes. And it was it was a tough fight,
Yeah.
but you
But
know.
demonstrative impact.
Absolutely. The impact,
Yeah.
that is definitely demonstrable impact.
Incredible, incredible, incredible. Let's talk about the harm done when people, going back to the beginning of our conversation, when people use, I guess, DE&I and ESG, ESG interchangeably and as masking and all of that. What is the harm of that?
Yeah, so from my perspective, the harm is you never fix either one, or you never find real solutions. And let me just add one other component to this. I've been around long enough when this work was just called diversity. It
Yep.
came on the heels of multiculturalism and affirmative action. Then we added the I, which was inclusion. It was like, okay, that I get that. Then in the last decade, we added the E, which was equity. Today, you will find organizations that have a DEI-B group, and the B is now belonging. There's another one that was just added called justice. And the reason why we keep adding all of these, not we, but the reason why the industry does, is because they can't figure out the first part. Because I believe that if you figure out the diversity part, and we have kind of who should be in the room, and you figure out the inclusion piece, belonging, justice, and the others are outcomes of getting those two right.
Right.
So we hide behind, let's add more letters, let's not do the actual work.
Wow. Wow, Dr. Metzler?
No, that's 100% correct.
Yeah.
And that is exactly, because people, I have people in the organization saying to me, when you finish with this diversity stuff, let me know so I can go back and do my job. Or I had someone the other day said, I have a question for you. If I hire this black woman who is a lesbian, she's in a wheelchair because she was injured in Iraq.
How many
What
points
do-
do I get?
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, and what do I
Yeah.
call her? Well, you know her name, right? So why don't we start there? But it's this whole notion of we keep adding. And folks are just like, okay, how many letters? Do you have the finance? Okay, so we're going to do finance, and we're going to do shareholder value, and we're going to, so it's FS. We don't have that. The only place we have this is with DEI, which tells you it is not an organizational imperative that is serious enough. It is an expansion of the so-called complaint office. That's what this is, and it continues to be so. I go all the way back to the Lynn Martin sexual harassment case, where I was a monitor on that case. That was a million years ago.
Right.
And it's still the same behaviors.
Let me ask this, because you touched on it, Dr. Metzler, and that is this notion of exhaustion when it
Yeah.
comes to this work, this conversation, this acronym, right? Just talk about the consequences, and I think we need to be honest and say that it's not just white folks that are becoming exhausted with this conversation, right? Talk about the risk associated with that, and if there's legitimacy to the argument, which I will make some space for, what's the solution?
Yeah, it is exhausting every day. It's exhausting for the organization. It's exhausting for everyone in the organization. It is particularly exhausting for chief diversity officers who have to deal with this every day. They think they have a budget, but they don't. The first thing to be cut is going to be there. They think they have support, but their leaders don't have the vision that's necessary. And so it ends up being, oh, well, we'll get to it when we get to it. And it doesn't matter what your race or ethnicity is. This is just exhausting work.
Kevin?
Yeah, so to me, it still goes back to the same thing.
Yeah.
What are we actually talking about? Because I've never heard my marketing counterparts or my communications counterparts or my operations counterparts talking about, man, this work is so exhausting. I just can't do it another day. And the reason why is because it's not clearly defined. It's not considered part of the business. So I admit it is exhausting because we're carrying like boulders on our back just to walk in the door. And when we get in the door, more boulders are added to our back. That doesn't happen in other organizations.
And then if I could just to follow the analogy, Kevin, essentially you're being instructed to walk in circles.
Right.
You're not actually going anywhere.
No,
with
you're
the work.
just,
Right.
you're the gerbil.
Yeah.
Just,
So for me, I've transferred the work also to my white male counterparts so that they can carry the boulders with me because they see the benefit of being more inclusive and creating an environment that everybody wins because it connects back to our success as an organization.
Back to impact. So to that point, Dr. Metzler, what I'm hearing are themes of going back to, if we get the first two parts right of the D and I, that eradicates a lot of the other letters of the alphabet. I understand that when we make it around a bottom line benefit to the best we can, we could play semantics, whether it's impact driven, whether it's a business case. The point is there is a fiscal benefit, right, that's being felt system and organization wide. Then we're talking about something that can be measured and that can be sustained and that can incentivize people outside of the complaint office. Is that all fair?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we go from that premise, how do we build on that?
well, the first thing we do is we start with the leaders and the leadership of the organization to demonstrate commitment to that. The whole role of the chief diversity officer or diversity officer, that has to be designed as a C-suite role. Now, with few exceptions, it is not.
Even though there's a C in front of it.
Oh,
Talk
yeah.
about how, because this is, I think we know, but let's just dissect it with the expert here. Why is the chief diversity inclusion officer not in the same bracket and categorization as your CFO, COO, et cetera?
Because this is viewed as trying to solve the failures of HR in attracting people of color to the organization, number one. Number two, organizations don't or have not demonstrated that they believe there's any value in diversity. Number three, organizations would rather give checks and sponsor events than to actually deal with the events within their own organization. It is the simple, oh yes, we do have a chief diversity officer. Well, what does that person do? Chief diversity officer stuff, which would be what?
Right.
Yeah, so Ebony, directly, the chief diversity officer title is a title. That's it. It's not,
No.
it doesn't have reporting lines, it doesn't have resources, it is a title. I have seen chief diversity officers that reported into directors. I have seen chief diversity officers that reported into VPs. It is it's gimmicky as a title. It doesn't come with the same, like you said.
Yeah.
Why is it not a chief financial officer?
Yeah.
Why is it not along the same lines? Organizations don't understand that.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think I'm not going to say it out loud because I'm here with the good people of the Greater Washington chapter of the Urban League, but I think we all know the acronym that it reminds us all of. And I'm going to leave it right there.
Leave it right there.
Okay. Okay. For those of us that are interested in making this more than a gimmicky title, and obviously that's the work of you gentlemen's careers and lives, what can we as a community do to support companies and organizations finding the value in the diversity, actually, and basically making this work easier for people like you and that represent this work in their various organizations. What can the community do, the culture do, even us in media do to help make this better for you and for us?
You wanna start?
So I think there's a couple things. One, communities can hold organizations accountable by asking CEOs about this work. Not how many checks have you written, it's what are you doing structurally, internally to kind of grow people within your organization. From a media standpoint, I would implore the media to call out what is happening right now. The work of DE&I is under attack. There are lawsuits in multiple states around this work. Recently, and I'll just talk about my state in Ohio, over 3 weeks ago, there was a bill that was floated that said, and I'm not talking about critical race theory, which that scared the hell out of white folks,
Of course.
but I'm talking about DEI. The bill, which is in our house locally, says any publicly funded institution that has a DEI department that teaches DEI will be defunded and you will not get any funds. That is colleges, universities, and what have you. How can that happen? Well, it happens because there's some fear as to what DEI is. If, again, going back to what I said before, if we, DE&I leaders, understood that what we're talking about is creating a bigger pie for everybody, it's not taking away from anybody. We're fighting over a slice of pie. We're talking about how do we grow the pie.
So that is, we got to again say the basic quiet part out loud. A lot of people that are opposed to this work see it as replacement theory.
Yes.
Flat out, right?
Yes.
Flat out.
That's it. They see it as replacement theory. They see y'all, whoever y'all are, blacks, gays, queers, Hispanics, whatever, as coming for their jobs, coming for their seats in higher learning institutions, coming for their houses, you name it. So how then, from a framing standpoint, Dr. Metzler, do we correct that false narrative?
So a couple of things. First of all, that DEI bill just passed in Texas. So what Kevin said, that bill just passed in Texas. And from the media standpoint, here's what the media is missing. In June, the Supreme Court is coming up with the affirmative action case, where essentially what it's going to do is to overturn affirmative action in college admissions. Once it does so, corporations are going to say, we'd like to continue DEI, but it would be illegal. No.
We talked about that on the AI panel for those of you that were here. Spoiler alert, affirmative action as we know it, just as the good doctor said, it's really done as of this summer.
It's done.
It's done. And then this is where kind of the integration of these brilliant panels that Greater Washington Urban League has put together today, they can't be in isolation of one another.
Yes.
Because then the AI biases show up in how colleges will now start doing admissions because, like you said, now they're no longer tethered to affirmative action as we know it.
And so let me talk just a bit about admissions tests, SATs, LSATs. I'm a graduate of Oxford Law School. Oxford tried for one semester to use the SAT and the LSAT. After that one semester, they threw it out.
Why?
They threw it out because they got the worst performing group of students ever.
Wow.
Oxford uses what we call admissions tutors. Essentially, they are responsible for reading your entire file, then determining whether you will first have a video interview, and then, if necessary, an on-campus interview, because they're looking at what you bring to the class as a whole.
Holistically, there's a holistic approach.
And Oxford is and continues to be the number one
premier
university in the world.
Globally. So what you're saying is I could have went to Oxford. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
absolutely.
Okay. I will let the good
Come on down.
Loyola know. I just wasted all my money. Go ahead.
So to take 15 seconds to talk about what you just said, and that is about the death of DEI.
Yeah.
All right. That's what they think. So here's what's happening.
Yeah.
All right. How all this work began, 1965, the U.S. Census Bureau, the government actually commissioned a think tank in Indiana called the Hudson Institute to do a democratic study, or I mean, Democrat. Okay, I just gave myself away there.
Subtext, right?
Right.
Freudian slip. There you go.
Right. To do a study on the demographics as to what was going to happen in the year 2000. It was called the Year 2000 Report. It scared white America to death because what that said was by the year 2000, only 35% of the entrants in the workforce were going to be white males. So now they're saying, wait a minute, that's only like in a few years, so what are we going to do? That's when diversity came up. So as we actually talked back in the green room, they think it's going to go away, but the reality is that in the early 2000s, the birth rate actually shifted.
Right.
There are more people of color that are being born today than white folks. So the whole context of we are minorities, that isn't even statistically or mathematically correct. So they're not going to have a choice at some point in time because the workforce is going to be women and people of color. So they can try to make it go away, but the simple demographics and birth rate is going to say, okay, so who are you going to have? Who are you going to hire?
They're just kicking a can down a road
Right,
that
absolutely.
ultimately will be cutting their nose off to spite their face. I wish we had 2 more hours with you two brilliant minds, seriously. We're going to have to leave it here, but I just want to say on behalf of the culture, we are so glad and blessed as a Black people to have gentlemen like you watching all of our backs on this issue. Amen. It is our hope that we can participate in this work alongside you. That's why I asked those questions. How do we show up in collaboration with your leadership? So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ebony.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. As always, Ebony, you have led another wonderful panel, and our panelists have given us a lot to think about, but also a lot to act on.